History books often ignore the men who actually fought the wars, but deep within medieval archives, a different story waits, written by the knights themselves. These knightly chronicles are not just dry lists of battles, they are personal diaries filled with raw ambition, deep faith, and the complex human spirit hiding behind the shining armor. By the end of our journey, you will see these legendary figures not as distant myths, but as real people, their true voices finally heard. We will uncover why a knight might hide a secret love letter inside an official report. We will investigate the case of a knight who was completely erased from the records. What were these warriors truly trying to prove when they told their own stories? The scratch of a quill is an unlikely soundtrack for a warrior's life. Yet in the quiet of a monastery scriptorium or a castle solar, we find our knight, his armor exchanged for the robes of a patron. He is not fighting with a sword in this moment, but with words, carefully dictating his story to a scribe whose hand moves steadily across parchment. This was not a casual hobby. The creation of a knightly chronicle was a deeply deliberate and expensive act, a project commissioned for the eyes of the future. It was about securing a family's legacy against the erosion of time, or providing a written justification for actions taken in a treacherous world of shifting political alliances. Think of these documents not as simple diaries, but as multi-purpose tools. They served as legal proof of land grants and titles, a written receipt for services rendered to a powerful lord. More personally, they were a defense, a way to explain and often glorify deeds that might otherwise be seen as controversial or even dishonorable. As historian Dr. Elena Vance observes, a knight's chronicle was his passport to immortality. It was a carefully constructed narrative, designed from the outset to control how future generations would perceive his name and his entire house. The very act of writing was a performance, a display of wealth, education, and piety. It blended historical fact with deliberate self-promotion, creating a curated life story. This is the crucial first step in our search for the real person behind the legend. To find the hidden stories, we must first accept that we are not reading objective history. We are reading a version of events that the knight wanted us to see. This sets the stage for a far more fascinating task, peeling back these layers of truth and fiction to discover what the knight tried to bury and what he desperately wanted to preserve forever. The perfect knight of the Chronicles is a gleaming statue of virtue. He is always courageous in battle, endlessly loyal to his king, and profoundly pious in his faith. This is the first and most obvious layer we encounter in these texts, a thick veil of chivalric ideals woven directly from the social and religious fabric of the Middle Ages. The knights who commissioned these works were deeply aware of this code. They knew their legacy depended on being seen as paragons, so they meticulously crafted their written image to reflect that ideal. They would fill pages with accounts of their devout pilgrimages, their generous donations to local abbeys, and their unwavering service in holy wars. Imagine reading a chronicle that spends 3 long paragraphs describing the exact weight of the silver candlesticks a knight gifted to a church. Then, in a single, dismissive line, it mentions a bitter, decade-long feud with a neighboring baron over a particularly valuable piece of farmland. The charity is magnified, the conflict is minimized. This was not necessarily lying, but it was a deliberate and strategic framing of a life. In a world where a man's social standing and political power were built upon his reputation, his chronicle was his most powerful tool for shaping that reputation for centuries to come. So we must approach these documents not as transparent windows into the past, but as expertly painted portraits. the artist has chosen the lighting, the pose, and the background to present his subject in the most flattering light possible. Our task, then, is not to simply admire the finished painting, but to look closely at the brushstrokes. We must question why certain shadows are deep and certain highlights are so bright. What is being pushed into the background and what is being brought to the very center of the frame? This conscious act of image-making is our first and most important clue. It forces us to ask a critical question. If a knight felt the need to project such an impeccable image of chivalry, what messy, complicated, or outright embarrassing truths was he trying to conceal beneath that glittering armor? That gleaming suit of plate armor was not just a military asset. It was a massive financial investment, the equivalent of a modern main battle tank. The warhorse that carried a knight into combat represented the price of a luxury sports car. This is the second layer we must uncover, the economic engine that drove the entire chivalric world. Behind every tale of battlefield glory was a complex and often precarious financial enterprise. When we learn to read the Chronicles with this in mind, the narrative shifts dramatically. The focus moves from the jousting field to the accounting ledger. Suddenly, long passages detailing a new land grant or a favorable marriage treaty are not boring footnotes. They are the very foundation of a knight's power. His ability to fight, to maintain his status, and to command loyalty was directly tied to the flow of coin and the productivity of his estates. A knight drowning in debt was a knight who could not afford to replace a slain horse or repair his equipment. He was effectively sidelined, his martial potential crippled by empty coffers. The Chronicles are quietly filled with these economic realities. They mention tax obligations to the crown, lists of rents collected from tenants, and even records of debts owed to Jewish moneylenders, who often served as the primary bankers in a world where the church forbade Christians from charging interest. A knight might boast of his new, fortified castle, but the Chronicle might also reveal he had to mortgage 2 valuable farms to a local abbey to pay for its construction. These financial pressures dictated every major decision. A knight might pledge his sword to a duke not out of unwavering loyalty, but because that duke was the highest bidder. He might agree to a marriage for his daughter not for love, but to settle a long-standing boundary dispute and merge 2 lucrative estates. The chivalric code preached honor above all, but the need for profit could bend or even break that code when survival was at stake. The romantic ideal of the knight-errant, roaming the land in search of noble deeds, is completely upended by this economic truth. His travels were likely mapped not by a quest for a holy grail, but by the location of debtors, wealthy patrons, and profitable tournaments. The Chronicle, therefore, becomes a surprising window into the entire medieval economy. It shows us how the relentless pursuit of wealth and security shaped the warrior class, forcing them to be as shrewd in business as they were skilled in combat. This stark reality of land, debt, and alliance is the unspoken truth that stands in complete contrast to the spotless, romanticized ideal. But the drive for wealth was always entwined with a dangerous game of power. A knight's oath of loyalty was not a simple promise. It was a web of conflicting obligations, pulling him between a distant king and a local lord, between the demands of the crown and the needs of his own family. This is the third layer we find in the archives, the intricate and often treacherous dance between the personal and the political. The grand chronicles of state might speak of treaties and royal decrees, but the knightly chronicles tell a different story. They reveal how a bitter personal feud with a neighboring baron over a stolen herd of sheep could escalate into a bloody regional conflict, dragging entire counties into a war born from petty pride. They show us how a marriage alliance was rarely about romance. It was a calculated move to secure a fragile peace or to merge two estates into a more powerful bloc, a transaction written in vows and sealed with land. These documents are filled with the quiet evidence of these delicate balances. They record the networks of patronage, listing the gifts given to secure a favorable position at court. They hint at the whispered conspiracies in castle halls, and they meticulously document the personal slights that motivated great acts of both betrayal and unwavering loyalty. A chronicle might praise a knight's faithful service to his king, but a closer look at the timeline could reveal that his loyalty only solidified after the king granted him a lucrative trade monopoly that crippled his rival. Personal insult was avenged not with a duel but with an economic stranglehold, all dressed in the language of royal service. This forces us to reconsider the very engine of history. The broad sweep of kingdoms and empires was often built upon a foundation of these very human and often very petty personal dramas. A king's decision to go to war could be influenced by a trusted knight's vendetta, framed as a matter of national honor. The political was always and remains a deeply personal affair. A knight's prayer before battle was more than a plea for salvation. It was a calculated negotiation with heaven itself. This fourth layer, the complex dance of faith and pragmatism, reveals how deeply religion was embedded in the very mechanics of power and warfare. The Chronicles are saturated with the language of divine will. Victories were attributed to God's favor. Defeats were framed as a test of faith or a punishment for sin. Yet behind this devout language often lay a ruthless political strategy. A military campaign against a rival could be rebranded as a holy crusade, securing not just God's blessing, but the crucial financial and political backing of the Pope. The seizure of a neighboring lord's fertile lands could be justified as an act of divine justice, cleansing the land of a heretic or a tyrant. Faith became the ultimate legitimizer for ambition. We see this duality in the stark contrast between action and atonement. A knight might record, in chillingly matter-of-fact terms, the sack of a city and the slaughter of its inhabitants. Then, just a few pages later, the same chronicle details a generous grant of land and wealth to a monastery, funding prayers for the salvation of the very souls he had sent to their judgment. This was not necessarily hypocrisy in the modern sense. It was a form of spiritual accounting, a balancing of the ledgers of the soul. Building a chapel or endowing a chantry where priests would pray for him in perpetuity was a pragmatic investment in his eternal future, a down payment on forgiveness. This intertwining of the sacred and the strategic shows that faith was not a separate compartment of a knight's life. It was the very air he breathed, a framework that shaped his understanding of the world and provided the tools to navigate it. His relationship with God was a constant dialogue, one that could comfort him in the darkness of his own fears, and yet also provide a ready-made excuse for his most violent and acquisitive deeds. How do we separate the genuine devotion from the political performance? The answer is that for the medieval knight, they were often one and the same. His belief empowered his actions, and his actions were constantly justified through his belief. This profound duality adds a crucial depth to our understanding, forcing us to see that the path to heaven was often paved with very earthly intentions. The voice echoing from a medieval chronicle is rarely a single, unfiltered sound. It is a chorus of influences, carefully arranged and recorded by a figure we almost never see, the scribe. Picture this man, a monk or a secular clerk, his hand cramping as he transforms a knight's rough, spoken account into elegant Latin script on sheets of expensive vellum. He is more than a simple recording device. His own education, his religious beliefs, and his literary training are active ingredients in the story we receive. A knight might describe a battle as a chaotic, brutal struggle for survival. The scribe, educated in classical texts, might reframe that same event using the grand language of Roman epic, turning a messy skirmish into a legendary clash of heroes. This was not necessarily deception. It was the professional application of a learned style, a way to elevate the patron's story to meet the literary standards of the age. But in that act of translation from memory to manuscript, subtle changes were inevitable. An unflattering detail might be quietly omitted. A rival's minor role could be shrunk to near invisibility. The scribe's own worldview, his loyalties to the monastery that fed him or the bishop who paid his wages, inevitably colored the ink. Then there is the patron, the powerful individual or institution funding the entire project. A chronicle commissioned by an abbey would naturally emphasize the knight's pious donations and his reverence for the church. The same knight's life, recorded for his own family's archives, might instead focus on his military conquests and the expansion of his estates. The patron's agenda set the narrative's ultimate destination. This collaborative process means we are never hearing just the knight. We are hearing the knight as interpreted by his scribe and as directed by his patron. The document becomes a negotiated text, a fragile compromise between memory, literary convention, and political necessity. This is why two chronicles about the same knight can sometimes seem to describe two entirely different men. One, written for his descendants, portrays a fierce and uncompromising warrior. The other, housed in a monastic library, remembers a gentle and generous benefactor. Both are true in their way, but both are also deeply curated. To find the human being at the center, we must learn to listen for the different voices in that chorus. We must ask who held the pen, who paid for the parchment, and what they hoped this expensive, permanent record would ultimately achieve. The parchment itself breathes with hidden stories. To truly understand a knightly chronicle, we must look past the words and see the physical object, a relic crafted from animal skin and oak gall ink. Its very substance is a silent witness. The quality of the vellum, whether it is thick and creamy or thin and coarse, speaks volumes about the knight's wealth. A luxurious manuscript made from the finest calfskin was a blatant display of power and prestige, as conspicuous as a golden belt buckle. Even the watermarks pressed into the paper, those unique designs visible only when held to the light, can trace the document's origin to a specific mill in Flanders or a monastery in northern France, mapping the economic networks that supported this warrior's life. The way the pages were bound, perhaps with simple leather straps or locked within an ornate, ironclad chest, tells us how the book was meant to be used and protected. Was it a daily reference, its spine cracked from frequent use, or a sacred heirloom, rarely opened and revered? But the most human secrets are often found in the margins. These blank spaces were not truly empty. They were filled with marginalia, the notes, corrections, and doodles added by scribes and readers across the centuries. Here, a later hand might have scrawled a cynical correction to a boastful battle account. There, a bored monk might have drawn a whimsical sketch of a grotesque face or a hunting dog in the corner, a tiny rebellion against the solemn text. These marks are unscripted, unguarded moments. They connect us directly to another person, long dead, who held this same page and felt compelled to leave their own small mark upon it. Then there are the scars. A patch of text might appear faint and confused, the original writing scraped away with a pumice stone to make room for new words. This is a palimpsest, a recycled page. In a world where parchment was incredibly expensive, the past was literally erased to make way for the present. The ghost of the older writing still lingers beneath the surface, a stubborn memory refusing to be completely forgotten. Every stain, every tear, every stitch in the binding tells a story of survival. A water stain might map a long-forgotten flood in the library. The worn corners of certain pages suggest they were turned most often, perhaps to reread a favorite passage detailing a great triumph or a beloved ancestor's deeds. This archaeological approach transforms the Chronicle from a mere container of information into a character with its own biography. It is a physical object that has been created, used, abused, and cherished, carrying the fingerprints of history in its very fibers. By studying its body, we learn not only what the knight wanted to say, but how his story lived on long after he was gone, shaped by the hands that preserved it. Sometimes the most revealing clue in an archive is not a record, but a void. In the county of Devon during the reign of King Edward I, a knight named Robert of Cadbury appears with quiet consistency. He is listed in the pipe rolls, the great financial records of the crown, paying his scutage tax. His name is inscribed in witness lists on charters for land transfers. He even appears in a bishop's register, standing as godfather for the son of a neighboring lord. Yet in every major chronicle that recounts the events of his time, the great narratives written to celebrate the powerful families of the region, Robert of Cadbury is a ghost. He is entirely absent. This is the mystery of the forgotten knight, a man who lived, paid, and swore oaths, but whose story was seemingly erased from the official memory of his age. Why was he written out of history? The silence surrounding him is a loud proclamation that something was amiss. Perhaps his family backed the wrong claimant in a bitter succession dispute, and the victors systematically purged all mention of their rivals from the celebratory chronicles. Maybe his bloodline ended with him. A knight with no living heirs had no one to commission a family history, no one to ensure his deeds were sung for future generations. He became a dead branch on the noble tree, quietly pruned away by historians who saw no use for him. A more tantalizing possibility is that he committed some grave, unspoken transgression, an act so contrary to the chivalric ideal that his contemporaries agreed, through a conspiracy of silence, to unmake him. To investigate a ghost, you cannot rely on the grand chronicles. You must become an archival detective, piecing together a life from the paperwork he left behind. The tax records prove he had wealth. The witness lists place him at the center of political life, trusted enough to validate the important transactions of his peers. The church registry shows he was integrated into the social and religious fabric of his community. These scattered fragments form the silhouette of a man, an outline filled with the quiet business of daily life, even as the grand narrative of his time refuses to acknowledge his existence. This case teaches us a profound lesson about how history is made. The Chronicles were not written to document every life. They were written to construct a specific past, one that glorified certain families and justified their power. Anyone who did not fit that narrative, whether through failure, disgrace, or simple irrelevance, risked fading into the parchment. The absence of a name can be as historically significant as its constant repetition, a stark reminder that the past we inherit is a carefully edited version of events, full of quiet ghosts waiting for someone to listen for their whispers. A Knight's Chronicle from the year 1387 describes a seemingly dull diplomatic journey to the court of Burgundy. The text details weather patterns, the quality of the roads, and the formal greetings exchanged. But if you read the first letter of every line in one particular passage vertically, a name emerges woven into the very fabric of the report: Isabel. This is no accident. It is a deliberate acrostic, a coded love letter hidden in plain sight within the driest of official documents. Why would a man of war and politics go to such creative and dangerous lengths? The answer lies in the rigid boundaries of his world. Marriages among the nobility were transactions of land and power, not of the heart. An attachment to a woman named Isabel, if she was from a rival house or already promised to another, could shatter hard-won alliances and invite disgrace. This hidden name is a testament to a relationship that had to remain in the shadows, a private truth that could never be part of his public legacy. To embed it within a formal chronicle was an act of breathtaking audacity. It was a way to immortalize a feeling in the only permanent thing he would ever create, his written record, ensuring that the woman he loved would, in some secret way, be remembered alongside his deeds of war and state. Decoding this requires us to step into the mind of a man trapped between his heart and his duty. The Chronicle was his official face, a mask of conformity. But within its strict lines, he found a way to inscribe a fragment of his true self. This single, whispered name does more than reveal a secret romance. It shatters the monolithic image of the unfeeling warrior. It shows us a man capable of profound vulnerability and clever subversion, using the very tool meant to cement his public image to instead preserve a private rebellion. The coded love letter is a powerful reminder that the grand narratives of politics and war are always undercut by these intimate human stories. They are the quiet, stubborn pulse of personal feeling that beats behind the armor, proving that even in the most regimented of lives, the heart finds a way to write its own history. A chronicle from the House of Lancaster describes the Battle of Blackwater Ford in meticulous detail. The text recounts a driving snowstorm that blinded the enemy, allowing the Lancastrian knights to charge across the frozen river and claim a glorious victory. The only problem is that the battle was fought in the middle of July, and climatic records from nearby monastic gardens confirm the summer was one of the hottest and driest in memory. This is not a minor inconsistency. It is a complete fabrication of reality, presenting our ninth mystery. Why would a chronicler invent a blizzard? The first possibility is the most straightforward, a deliberate lie to mask a humiliating defeat. If the Lancaster forces were routed in a straightforward fight, recasting the event as a miraculous victory against a supernatural storm provides a noble excuse for the loss, transforming military failure into a drama of heroic perseverance against impossible odds. Exaggerating the enemy's numbers by a factor of 10 serves the same purpose, making a minor skirmish feel like an epic, world-altering clash. Yet the lie could be more profound. Perhaps the knight who commissioned the Chronicle was not even at Blackwater Ford. His entire account might be a tapestry woven from the boasts of returning soldiers and his own imagination, a narrative constructed to insert himself into a pivotal moment in history from which he was actually absent. In this light, the impossible snowstorm is not an error, but a literary flag, a blatant signal that we are reading fiction dressed as fact. It functions like the special effects in a modern blockbuster, a spectacle designed to enhance the heroism of the protagonist and make his tale more compelling than the messy, blood-soaked truth. The Chronicle might further attribute the victory to a divine miracle, perhaps the sudden appearance of a saint in the sky, solidifying the family's claim that they enjoyed God's unique favor. How do we decide between a cover-up and a fantasy? The key often lies in the specific language. A chronicle intended to hide a defeat will often be defensive in tone, spending an inordinate amount of time explaining why the circumstances justified a retreat or a tactical withdrawal. A chronicle built from hearsay and ambition, however, will read like an epic poem, full of flawless heroics and simplistic morality, with the knight always at the very center of every decisive action. This anomalous battle account is a masterclass in skepticism. It screams that these documents cannot be taken at face value. Every so-called fact must be weighed and measured against other sources, from tax records to the diaries of their rivals. We must learn to read the gaps and the glorifications, understanding that a chronicle is often our argument, a piece of sophisticated propaganda aimed at the court of public opinion and the judgment of future generations. The truth of a man's life may not be in the great battle he claims to have won, but in the small, desperate lie he told to make himself a hero. A single line in a chronicle can unravel an entire history. In the final entry for Sir Alaric of Hawkwood, his scribe notes that the knight, sensing his death was near, dictated his last will and testament. The Chronicle claims this document would finally settle the fate of his vast, disputed borderlands and reveal his true wishes for his 3 ambitious sons. Yet no such will has ever been found. This is the mystery of the Lost Testament, a missing document with the power to rewrite the history of an entire region. Its absence is a black hole in the archive, a deliberate void that screams of intrigue. Was the will destroyed by the eldest son, who stood to inherit everything by traditional law but feared his father's true intentions? Did a rival family whose claim to the land was weak steal and burn the parchment to create a legal chaos from which they could profit? Or was the document suppressed by the church itself because Sir Alaric, in his final hours, confessed to a belief the bishops deemed heretical, or perhaps left his wealth not to a monastery, but to an unapproved charitable order? The search for this ghost document becomes a lesson in historical forensics. Historians are forced to become detectives, scouring the archives of noble families for any hint of the ensuing legal battle. They examine papal records for letters of complaint or appeals. They dig through dusty court proceedings, looking for the case between the Hawkwood brothers, hoping the arguments presented there will echo the lost provisions of the will they are fighting over. This historical vacuum is filled with speculation, a careful reconstruction based entirely on circumstantial evidence. If the second son, who was known to be his father's favorite, suddenly gained an unexpected title years later, was that the ghost of the will's intention finally asserting itself? If the local abbey, which had expected a generous bequest, received nothing and then launched a bitter campaign against the Hawkwood name, does that point to a suppressed document that snubbed them? The story of the lost will teaches us that history is not just what is saved, it is also shaped by what is deliberately erased. The preservation of the past is a fragile thing, a matter of chance, power, and often ruthless self-interest. A single piece of parchment could have settled a century of debate, but its absence forces us to listen to the silence and to question every truth we think we know. A knight's journey across the known world forced him to become an observer of humanity. Far from the familiar fields of France or England, he walked through the bustling markets of Acre and stood beneath the impossible dome of the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople. In his chronicle, amid the expected accounts of prayer and battle, we find something far more surprising: the careful notes of an accidental ethnographer. He recorded the cut of a Syrian merchant's robe, the complex barter system used in Anatolian bazaars, and the strange, fermented drink of a Baltic chieftain. These were not the writings of a dispassionate scholar, but the vivid, ground-level impressions of a soldier trying to make sense of a world utterly alien to him. His pen captured details that the official court historians, writing from a safe distance, would never think to include. He noted how the women of a particular tribe styled their hair, or how the merchants of Cairo negotiated contracts with a handshake and a spoken verse from their holy text. These are the sounds and textures of daily life, preserved because they struck the knight as unusual or noteworthy. Of course, his observations were filtered through the rigid lens of his own medieval Christian worldview. He might describe a sophisticated Islamic legal court as merely a curious pagan ritual, or misinterpret a gesture of profound respect as a sign of submission. The Chronicle is a snapshot, but one developed in a solution of deep cultural bias. Yet this very bias is what makes the account so revealing. We see not only the foreign culture being described, but the knight's own mind struggling to categorize it. He is constantly comparing, judging, and fitting the unfamiliar into the only framework he possesses. When he writes with astonishment about the public baths of the Middle East, his surprise tells us just as much about the bathing habits of his own society as it does about the one he is visiting. This reframes the knight not as a simple conqueror, but as a bridge, however shaky, between worlds. His chronicle becomes a unique cultural artifact, a view from the road of an interconnected medieval globe. Long before the age of formal anthropology, these warriors were compiling raw, unpolished data on the human family, offering us a priceless perspective that is both deeply flawed and utterly irreplaceable. Every line and color on a knight's shield was a sentence in a silent speech. The chronicles are filled with these visual declarations, a heraldic language that shouted a man's identity across a crowded battlefield or a bustling tournament field. A golden lion rampant on a field of red was not merely a decoration. It was a bold claim to the virtue of courage, a symbol meant to intimidate foes and inspire allies. More importantly, these designs were legal trademarks of bloodline. A specific pattern of checks or a unique arrangement of stripes could prove a knight's direct descent from a celebrated hero, granting him not just prestige but a legitimate claim to lands and titles. This was a code that everyone in the medieval world was trained to read, a visual grammar of power. Chroniclers wielded this symbolic shorthand with precision. They might describe a young knight's new coat of arms as featuring a white swan, a creature often associated with purity and courtly love. This single, carefully chosen image communicated his intentions to be seen as a refined and honorable suitor, not just a brute warrior. If that same knight's shield later appeared in the chronicle with the swan depicted triumphantly gripping a serpent, the audience would immediately understand he had overcome a treacherous enemy, with the serpent symbolizing the deceit he had defeated. The imagery did the work of 1,000 words, telling a story of moral victory through symbol alone. To understand this language is to gain a second lens through which to read the chronicles. The text might describe a knight's valiant deeds, but his coat of arms reveals how he wanted those deeds to be framed and remembered. It was a core part of his personal branding, a logo designed for eternity. The manuscripts that paired detailed illustrations of these arms with the written narrative were, in effect, multimedia presentations. The word and the image worked in concert, one providing the action and the other the identity, building a powerful and unforgettable legend for the knight and his entire family. What personal secret or unspoken ambition might a man have hidden in the symbols he chose to represent his name for all time? The shield and the sword were not the only tools that built a knight's legacy. Behind the public performance of chivalry, another hand often guided the quill. To assume these chronicles are purely masculine records is to miss half the story. Women of the noble class were not silent spectators. They were patrons, persuaders, and the quiet architects of the very stories we read today. A powerful dowager, a shrewd wife, or a determined mother could commission a chronicle to secure her family's future, ensuring that her children's claim to their father's lands was unassailable. Her influence was woven into the narrative's very fabric, a subtle thread of guidance and ambition. Her own surviving letters, tucked into the same archive chests as the formal chronicles, often tell a parallel story. They reveal the domestic and diplomatic pressures that truly fueled military campaigns. A wife's urgent message might speak of a rival's insult that required a forceful response, or of a debt that could only be settled with the spoils of war. The chronicle itself might record the glorious battle, but her correspondence reveals the private anxieties and strategic calculations that launched the army in the first place. In rare and precious instances, the chronicle breaks form entirely to include a prayer composed by the lady of the castle or a brief, first-person reflection on a child's birth. These are fractured glimpses, but they are invaluable. They pull back the curtain on the world behind the throne room, a world managed by women who upheld the estate, raised the next generation of knights, and wielded a soft power that was every bit as real as the force of arms. The story of knighthood was never a solo performance. It was a complex duet, co-authored by the women who held the fortress steady while the knight was away at war. A knight's chronicle from the 1340s describes a sound unlike any other on the battlefield: the sudden, sickening thud of an armor-piercing bodkin arrowhead striking plate steel. This was the voice of the English longbow at Crecy, a technological shock that echoed through the parchment for decades. These personal records are our most intimate logbooks of a medieval arms race, a period where the very tools of war evolved with terrifying speed. The knights themselves were the frontline observers of this revolution, and their writings trace a clear arc of adaptation and fear. Early mentions of the crossbow are often dismissive, a weapon for commoners that could not match the noble longsword in honorable combat. But that tone shifts dramatically over time. The crossbow's ability to punch through chainmail at a distance forced a fundamental change in personal defense, spurring the development of the sophisticated full-plate armor we associate with the late medieval knight. This was not a fashion choice, it was a matter of survival. Each new weapon demanded a countermeasure, and each countermeasure, in turn, inspired a more powerful weapon. The Chronicles capture this deadly dance in real time. A French knight's account of Crecy does not read like a tactical analysis, it reads like a trauma. He writes of the sky darkening with English arrows, a storm that ignored the valor of his charge and slaughtered his expensive war horses, crippling his mobility before he could even reach the enemy line. This is the human reaction to technological obsolescence. His world, built on the supremacy of the mounted, armored warrior, was being dismantled by a humble length of yew wood. Then came the most unsettling innovation of all, early gunpowder. The first descriptions of these primitive cannons are filled with as much superstition as military detail. Knights wrote of the devil's thunder and a foul, sulphurous smoke that blinded and terrified men and horses alike. These weapons did not just kill, they demoralized. They introduced a chaotic, impersonal element to a conflict that was still, in theory, governed by a code of personal bravery. The Chronicles show us knights grappling with a world where a single, unaimed shot from a noisy iron tube could kill the most expensively equipped and highly trained man on the field, a reality that struck at the very heart of the chivalric ideal. In their detailed complaints and frantic adaptations, these warriors were unknowingly writing the first draft of the history of military technology. Their personal fears and strategic shifts provide a ground-level view of a revolution, documenting the moment when the age of the knight began to give way to the age of the gun. The clang of steel is the soundtrack to these chronicles, a noise woven through with the raw terror of men who knew they were both predators and prey. For all the talk of glory, these texts do not shy away from the visceral aftermath of a sacked city. One knight, his hand likely trembling as he dictated, described the streets running not with water, but with a thick, dark liquid, and the air so thick with smoke and screams that it became difficult to breathe. This is not the language of a triumphant hero. It is the haunted testimony of a man waking from a nightmare, one he helped to create. In these unguarded moments, the chronicle becomes a confession booth. The same warrior who boasts of his strength in one paragraph might, in the next, recount the face of a young enemy squire, bleeding out in the mud, and admit to a sudden, overwhelming pang of pity. He saw not a faceless foe, but a boy, someone's son, and the professional mask of violence slipped to reveal a flicker of shared humanity. This internal conflict was structured, even monetized, through the elaborate system of ransom. A captured knight was not simply a defeated enemy, he was a walking treasury. His life had a precise monetary value based on his title, his lands, and his family's reputation. This created a bizarre incentive for mercy on the battlefield. Why kill a valuable opponent when you could parole him and use the ransom to build a new castle wing or pay off your own debts? The Chronicles are filled with these transactions, detailing the polite negotiations that would occur after the fury of combat had faded. A knight might share a meal with the very man he had been trying to kill hours before, now discussing the terms of his release like two merchants haggling over the price of a prize horse. This cold calculus of life and profit sits uneasily alongside the Church's eternal teachings. The chroniclers constantly wrestle with this dissonance. How could a man who attended Mass every morning and donated generously to the abbey also be a man who, by afternoon, was leading a charge that would leave hundreds dead? The answer was a fragile, constantly renegotiated compromise. The knight saw his violence as a professional necessity, a grim duty required to maintain the social order he was sworn to protect. His piety was the counterbalance, the mechanism for atoning for the souls he was forced to send to God. He was not a hypocrite. He was a man living in a world of impossible contradictions, striving to build a fortress of faith around a heart hardened by the brutal requirements of his station. This is the deepest layer of the knight's psyche, the fragile truce between the killer he had to be and the believer he hoped to become. A knight's world was not defined by lines on a map, but by the lay of the land itself. His chronicle reveals a mental geography drawn in stone, water, and timber, a strategic blueprint for power where every feature held a purpose. Castles were not just homes, they were the anchors of this world, perched on hills to control the surrounding countryside and the roads that snaked through the valleys below. He described his journeys not by the miles traveled, but by the landmarks passed. He would note the old oak tree that marked the boundary of his hunting rights, the shallow ford across the river Severn where cattle could be driven to market, and the narrow pass through the Welsh marches that could be held by a dozen men against an army. This was not a love of scenery, it was a practical obsession. Controlling this geography meant controlling the wealth and security of the region. The lord who owned the only bridge for 20 miles held the power of life and death over trade and travel, collecting tolls and deciding who could cross. A knight's allegiance was forged in this local soil. His primary loyalty was to his patria, his own small country of rolling hills, familiar villages, and ancestral fields. The abstract idea of a nation like France or England was a distant concept, often weaker than his bond to the neighboring baron with whom he shared a forest or a river. This explains actions that seem illogical to us today. A knight might refuse a king's call to arms not from disloyalty, but because a rival from the next valley was threatening his harvest, and his first duty was to the land that gave his family its name and its bread. His chronicle, filled with these precise territorial details, is a guide to this vanished mental landscape. By tracing his careful descriptions of a forest edge or a disputed mill pond, we can reconstruct the true strategic logic of his life. We begin to see the world through his eyes, a patchwork of personal domains where power was measured not in square miles, but in control over the next river crossing and the loyalty of the villages that looked to his castle for protection. The battlefield was only one theater in a knight's long and varied life. For every season of war, there were years of peace, and during these stretches, the chronicle's focus shifts from the clash of steel to the weight of a ledger and the hum of a thriving estate. We find our knight not on a charging destrier, but seated at a wooden table in his manor hall, listening to the grievances of his tenants. He acts as a local judge, settling disputes over a stolen pig or the precise boundary between two farmers' fields. His authority, once measured in martial prowess, is now exercised through the careful administration of justice. These long, peaceful interludes reveal the knight as the chief executive officer of a complex agricultural enterprise. His chronicle meticulously records the success of the wheat harvest, the number of new lambs born in the spring, and the construction of a new mill that will grind his tenants' grain and fill his own coffers with a share of the flour. His wealth and his family's future were built not only on plunder, but on the quiet, relentless productivity of the land. This administrative life was balanced by the vibrant culture of the court. The same hands that held a sword learned the delicate steps of a formal dance. The Chronicles describe the immense preparation for a great feast, the hiring of minstrels, the intricate rules of courtly love poetry, and the complex logistics of hosting a tournament. These were not mere frivolities. A grand tournament was a massive economic stimulus for the region and a crucial political stage where alliances were forged and a family's status was put on display for all to see. The knight's identity was a tapestry woven from many threads. The warrior was just one color in a much richer picture that included the judge, the farmer, the patron, and the courtier. To see him only as a man of war is to miss the essence of his world. His true legacy was built not just in moments of violent conquest, but in the steady, day-by-day work of building a life that would endure long after the fighting was done. A knight's chronicle from the 13th century does not begin with a prayer, but with a line from the Roman poet Virgil. This was not an isolated act of pretension, but a window into a sophisticated intellectual world. The image of the knight as a simple, uneducated brute shatters against the reality that many were steeped in the classics, their minds shaped by the same texts that had guided emperors and philosophers. Their education, often received in cathedral schools or from private tutors, equipped them with a powerful toolkit for understanding their own turbulent times. By framing their personal battles and political struggles through the lens of Roman history, they connected their lives to a grand, timeless narrative of rise and fall, virtue and ambition. A baron quelling a rebellion might consciously model his account on the Roman general Scipio Africanus, his chronicle carefully drawing parallels to suggest a similar strength and strategic genius. Another knight, reflecting on a period of exile from court, might quote the Stoic philosopher Seneca on the fickleness of fortune, using the ancient words to give shape and dignity to his own personal misfortune. This was more than showing off, it was a way of thinking. The classical past provided a ready-made library of human experience, a set of models and cautionary tales that helped a knight make sense of his own role in the world. He lived within a Christian framework, to be sure, but his intellectual horizons stretched back to a pagan antiquity whose wisdom he saw as complementary, not contradictory. The Chronicle becomes a palimpsest of its own, with the voice of a medieval warrior speaking through the borrowed authority of a Roman historian. This practice reveals a knight who was not just a man of action, but a man of contemplation, one who saw his life as a chapter in a story that began long before his birth and would continue long after his death. He was building his legacy not only on land and title, but on the foundation of a shared European memory, claiming his place in a lineage of heroes that stretched back to the very dawn of recorded history. Jean de Joinville's chronicle opens not with a fanfare for the Seventh Crusade, but with a moment of quiet dread. He confesses that as he prepared to leave his lands, the sight of his own castle gates brought him to tears, for he did not know if he would ever see them again. This raw, personal admission sets the tone for an account that feels startlingly modern in its honesty. Joinville was a close companion to King Louis IX of France, and his life of Saint Louis is perhaps the most intimate portrait we have of any medieval monarch. precisely because it is filtered through the unwavering gaze of a friend. He gives us the king in full, not just the saint. We see Louis dispensing justice beneath an old oak tree at Vincennes, but we also see him impatiently snapping at his brother during a tense war council. Joinville describes the king's profound piety, his hours spent in prayer, yet he does not omit the man's very human moments of frustration and weariness. This is not a sterile official history. It is a memoir filled with the grit and texture of a long, difficult campaign. Joinville writes of the oppressive heat, the strange and debilitating diseases that crippled the army, and the constant, gnawing fear that followed them from France to the sands of Egypt. He recounts the terror of his own capture, the humiliation of being held for ransom, and the complex negotiations for his release. In one particularly vivid scene, he describes being so weakened by illness that he had to be carried in a litter, and in his delirium, he tore his outer garments out of a feverish conviction that he was being suffocated by a treacherous knight. These are not the grand, heroic gestures of chivalric romance. They are the vulnerable, undignified struggles of a real man caught in the brutal machinery of a holy war. Through Joinville's eyes, we understand that a crusade was not a continuous parade of faith and victory. It was a grinding test of endurance, a logistical nightmare of supply lines and sickness, where faith was often the only comfort in the face of overwhelming despair. His Chronicle masterfully weaves together the grand narrative of a crusade with the small, telling details of daily life, from the taste of rotten food to the sound of Saracen war drums in the night. He shows us a saint in the making, but he never lets us forget the flawed, compassionate, and occasionally short-tempered human being behind the legend. In doing so, Joinville gives us something far more valuable than a perfect hero. He gives us a man, and in turn, he gives us the truest measure of the king's enduring legacy, built not on myth alone, but on the unwavering loyalty of those who knew him best. A single line in the Marcher Lord's Chronicle notes the capture of a Welsh raiding party, followed not by a boast of valor, but by a precise entry: 4 men taken, ransoms set at 15 marks for the leader and 5 marks for each of his men. Total income 35 marks. This document is a unique hybrid, a relentless fusion of military narrative and financial ledger that lays bare the brutal economics of border warfare. For this lord, guarding the turbulent frontier between England and Wales was not a chivalric calling. It was a high-risk business venture. Every event, from a small skirmish to the construction of a new watchtower, was meticulously recorded in terms of its cost and its return. The Chronicle reads like a merchant's account book from a war zone. A successful counter-raid is described not for its tactical brilliance, but for the 23 head of cattle reclaimed and the 10 additional sheep seized as compensation for lost time and effort. The death of a trained warhorse is a catastrophic capital loss, its value carefully noted alongside the price of its replacement. Even acts of destruction are framed as investments. The burning of a Welsh granary is logged as a strategic depletion of the enemy's resources, a calculated move to weaken their economic resilience for the next season. This cold arithmetic governed every decision. The Lord would calculate whether the cost of hiring 20 additional mercenary crossbowmen for a month was justified by the potential plunder from a specific valley. He weighed the expense of maintaining a garrison in a remote stone tower against the tolls it could collect from the mountain pass it controlled. His legacy was not built on epic poems, but on balanced ledgers and productive pastures won through calculated violence. This perspective shatters any remaining romantic illusions. Here, the knight is fully revealed as a CEO of conflict, his castle a corporate headquarters, his soldiers a payroll expense, and his chronicle the annual report for a lifetime spent trading in blood and land. The same digital tools that define our modern world are now breathing new life into these ancient manuscripts. High-resolution multispectral imaging acts like a technological time machine, peeling back the centuries. A parchment that appears blank to the human eye, its ink faded to near nothingness by time and damp, can suddenly reveal its secrets under specific wavelengths of light. This process can recover a prayer scrawled in a margin, a financial record, or even an entire love letter that was scraped away to create a palimpsest. Suddenly, a document we thought we knew completely offers up a brand new story. For the historian, this is like discovering a hidden room in a castle you have studied your entire life. Alongside this, digital paleography tools are acting as patient, infinitely knowledgeable tutors. The handwriting of a 13th century French scribe is vastly different from that of a 15th century German clerk. Learning to read these varied scripts known as hands was a lifelong discipline. Now, interactive software allows anyone to practice transcribing these challenging texts, with the program offering gentle corrections and identifying common letter forms. This breaks down one of the most formidable barriers, the sheer difficulty of reading the script itself. The final piece of this revolution is the creation of vast online databases. A researcher in California can now cross-reference a knight's chronicle from a small English archive with papal letters from the Vatican, financial records from Paris, and a rival's memoir from Budapest, all in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. This interconnected web of information allows us to verify claims, trace the movement of people and ideas, and spot patterns that would have taken a solitary scholar a lifetime to uncover. These tools are not replacing the historian. They are empowering a new generation of detectives, both professional and amateur, to engage directly with the primary sources. The physical walls of the archive and the linguistic hurdle of archaic script are crumbling, allowing the true, unedited voices of the past to speak to us more clearly than they have in centuries. The true test of a chronicle story begins when you place it beside another. Reading a single knight's account is like hearing only one side of a heated argument. To understand the full truth, you must invite every other voice in the room to speak. This is the historian's craft of triangulation, a method that builds a three-dimensional picture from many flat, conflicting reports. Take a battle described in glorious detail by a French knight. His chronicle will naturally place his own courage at the center of a victorious struggle. Now find an account from the other side, perhaps from an Arabic chronicler or a Byzantine historian who witnessed the same event. The story will transform. The French charge, portrayed as a decisive hammer blow in one version, might be remembered by the other side as a minor skirmish that was easily repelled. The numbers of the enemy will shrink or swell depending on who is holding the pen. By holding these opposing narratives side by side, the exaggerations and omissions become glaringly obvious. You start to see the shape of the real event hidden between the lines of propaganda, but written sources are only part of the conversation. You must then consult the dry, unemotional records of administration. If a knight's chronicle claims he was granted a vast tract of land for his loyal service, check that claim against the royal pipe rolls, the meticulous financial records of the crown. These documents will list every land grant, every tax paid, and every fee owed. The parchment does not lie for glory. It might confirm his boast, or it might reveal that the land was actually inherited from his wife, a fact his chronicle conveniently omitted to make his own deeds seem grander. Papal letters can offer another angle, revealing if the knight sought the church's blessing for his actions or was perhaps censured for them. Finally, you turn to the ground itself. Archaeology allows the very earth to testify. A chronicle might describe a famous castle as being stormed and burned to its foundations. An archaeological dig at that castle site can search for the layer of ash and scorched stone that confirms the story. Or it might find no evidence of a great fire at all, suggesting the destruction was a literary flourish to make a simple takeover seem more dramatic. This practice of contextual reading is what separates likely fact from probable fiction. It turns the solitary act of reading into a dynamic cross-examination of the entire medieval world. You are no longer a passive listener to one man's story. You become a detective, piecing together a consensus from the conflicting testimonies of clerks, kings, enemies, and the silent, enduring stones. The language a knight chose to record his life was never a neutral decision. It was a declaration of identity, a clear signal of who he was and who he hoped would listen. When a chronicle was written in the formal, structured grammar of medieval Latin, it was an act of joining a timeless conversation with kings, popes, and ancient scholars. This was the language of the Church, of international diplomacy, and of serious official history. A Latin chronicle carries a certain tone of detached authority, as if the events are being presented for the judgment of God and posterity. The knight becomes a figure in a grand historical tapestry, his personal feelings often smoothed over by the polished, impersonal language of the educated elite. The scribe, a trained cleric, was the gatekeeper of this tone, translating the knight's raw, spoken experiences into a format deemed worthy of permanent record. But then we have the chronicles written in the vernacular, in the knight's own earthy Old French or robust Middle English. These texts feel different from the very first sentence. They are filled with the intimate, colloquial speech of the castle hall and the battlefield. The emotional distance collapses. In a vernacular account, a knight might describe the death of a comrade not with a sterile Latin epitaph, but with the guttural cry of a grieving friend, using the exact same words he would have shouted across a smoky campfire. The choice of language directly reveals the intended audience. A Latin chronicle was meant for a broad, powerful, and educated readership. A vernacular text, however, was often written for the knight's own family, his immediate household, and the local community that shared his tongue. It was a private legacy, not a public monument. This is where we hear the most authentic voice, the one less filtered through the expectations of the international elite. He might use a local dialect word for a type of sword stroke or a regional proverb to explain a difficult decision, things a Latin chronicle would never deign to include. The very rhythm of the vernacular text is more personal, more immediate. It can carry the weight of sarcasm, the spark of humor, or the raw edge of fear in a way that formal Latin often struggles to convey. Recognizing this linguistic divide, even when reading a modern English translation, adds a crucial layer of understanding. When you read a passage that feels official, stately, and remote, you are likely engaging with a Latin-based perspective. When the text suddenly feels conversational, packed with sensory detail and emotional honesty, you are probably hearing the echo of the vernacular, the knight's own voice, carefully preserved and waiting after all these centuries to finally be heard. A knight's chronicle did more than record his own deeds. It drew a sharp line between his world and everyone outside it. When his pen described Muslims, Jews, heretics, or even the peasants who worked his own fields, he was not writing an objective report. He was constructing an identity for himself by defining what he was not. These portrayals of the other are almost never neutral. They are thick with prejudice, a deep-seated fear of the unfamiliar, and an unshakable belief in his own cultural and religious superiority. This process of othering was a powerful political tool. By painting his enemies as monstrous or less than human, a knight could justify the seizure of their lands, the violence of a crusade, or the brutal suppression of a religious minority. He framed conquest not as greed but as a holy duty, a cleansing of the world from corruption. The language is often chillingly effective. A Muslim warrior, a skilled and disciplined opponent, might be described in a chronicle not as a soldier but as a faceless Saracen horde, a dehumanizing term that stripped away individual humanity and made slaughter feel like a religious service. Jewish communities, often serving as essential moneylenders in a Christian society that forbade usury, were frequently depicted in these texts as greedy and conniving, a stereotype that provided a ready excuse for persecution and the cancellation of debts. Even the peasant, the foundation of the entire feudal economy, could be rendered in the Chronicles as a brutish, simple creature, his labor taken for granted and his humanity ignored, thus justifying his permanent place at the bottom of the social order. Yet, nestled within this cauldron of bias, we sometimes find moments of startling contradiction. The same chronicle that vilifies the Saracen as a demon might, in the very next passage, express a grudging admiration for the quality of his sword steel or the disciplined formations of his army. A knight traveling through the Middle East might record his astonishment at the advanced hospitals of Cairo or the sophisticated irrigation systems that turned deserts green, marvels that simply did not exist in his homeland. These are flashes of cognitive dissonance, moments where the reality of a complex, advanced culture briefly punctures the simplistic narrative of superiority. How do we reconcile the knight who could dismiss an entire people as infidels with the same man who could meticulously describe their architectural genius or their medical knowledge? The answer lies in the fundamental purpose of his narrative. The knight's chronicle was above all a story about himself. He needed the other to be threatening enough to justify his violence, but occasionally their accomplishments were so undeniable that acknowledging them only served to make his own victory over them seem even more impressive. This practice of defining the self against the other is not a relic of a distant past. It is a human impulse with profound and lasting consequences, a process that has shaped borders, fueled conflicts, and built identities for centuries. By listening carefully to how a knight wrote about those he considered different, we learn less about the others themselves and far more about the fears and fragile self-image of the man holding the pen. A knight's world was shaped by forces far greater than any king or emperor. The chronicles are filled with a constant, low hum of environmental pressure, a reminder that nature was the ultimate power in a pre-industrial society. Long before we had weather satellites or temperature records, these warriors were acting as accidental climatologists, meticulously noting the conditions that dictated their fate. A bitter winter was not just an inconvenience, it was a strategic event. When a chronicler wrote that the Thames froze solid for 3 months, he was describing a world transformed. That frozen river became a highway, allowing armies to march across what was normally a formidable defensive barrier, turning the logic of warfare upside down. A summer drought was not merely a dry spell. It was a catastrophe that wilted crops in the field, caused the price of bread to skyrocket, and sparked peasant revolts that could topple a local lord. The knight's response to these events was recorded in his ledger. He might note the cost of importing grain from a less affected region or the lost revenue from tenants who could not pay their rent after a failed harvest. His chronicle becomes a desperate balance sheet of survival, where the real enemy was often the sky itself. Beyond the fields and rivers lay the forests, immense and dark. These were not the managed woodlands of today, but vast, untamed wildernesses that covered much of Europe. In the Chronicles, the forest is a place of profound danger and mystery. It was the refuge of outlaws and poachers, men who knew its hidden paths and could vanish into the thick undergrowth beyond the reach of the knight's law. But the danger was also imagined. The same chronicle that warns of real bandits might also speak of wolves the size of horses, or of spectral hounds and malevolent tree spirits that guarded the deep woods. This was a landscape alive with supernatural threat, a physical manifestation of the unknown. When a knight described the edge of a great forest, he was mapping the boundary of his own control, beyond which lay chaos. His perception of nature was a complex blend of practical observation and deep-seated superstition. He relied on the forest for timber to build his halls and fuel his hearths, and for the game that stocked his larder. Yet he also feared it as a place where the rational order of his world dissolved. These detailed descriptions of weather patterns, animal migrations, and the sheer, overwhelming presence of wilderness are priceless to modern scientists. They provide a baseline, a written snapshot of a European ecosystem long since paved over by cities and carved up by farmland. The knight's fear of a harsh winter or his account of a river teeming with salmon he could no longer catch tells a story of a climate now lost to time. His chronicle, intended to record his own glory, inadvertently became a testament to the planet he inhabited, a fragile record of a world where humanity was still at the mercy of the wind and the rain. The final word of a chronicle was never its end, but merely the beginning of a long and unpredictable journey. Once the ink dried, the parchment was often rolled tight, sealed with wax, and locked within a heavy iron chest in the family's great hall. Here it was both a treasure and a tool, a legal deed to be consulted during disputes over land or inheritance. But a single fire, a forgotten chest in a damp cellar, or the simple failure of a bloodline could cast this precious object adrift. Its next home was often the cool, silent scriptorium of a monastery, where it was saved from decay not for its stories of battle, but for the practical value of its blank margins or, in a desperate act of recycling, its entire surface. A monk might carefully scrape away the tale of a knight's valor to make room for a copy of the Psalms, creating a palimpsest where a ghost of the secular past lingered beneath the sacred text. Centuries later, a Renaissance humanist, obsessed with recovering the classical world, might stumble upon this same manuscript in a monastic library. He would dismiss the medieval knight story as barbaric nonsense, yet he would meticulously preserve the physical book for the sake of a single Latin quotation from an ancient Roman author that he found tucked within its pages. The Chronicle's survival was often a matter of pure chance, its value judged by standards its author could never have foreseen. In this way, a straightforward account of a minor border skirmish, copied and recopied by hand over generations, could slowly warp and expand. The knight's modest foe became a giant, his small victory a divinely ordained miracle. Scribes embellished the story, adding dramatic speeches and angelic interventions. By the time the tale reached the ears of a local bard, it had been stripped of its historical context and reborn as an epic ballad, sung in taverns for the price of a drink. The knight was no longer a man, but a symbol of regional pride or national identity, his actual life buried beneath layers of poetic license. The Chronicle's meaning was never fixed. It was a vessel filled and refilled by every generation that discovered it. A 19th-century nationalist historian might mine its pages for evidence of his country's ancient glory, deliberately misinterpreting a feud between two lords as a proto-patriotic struggle. In our own digital age, the journey accelerates. A high-resolution scan of that same manuscript is uploaded to a global database, where its data is mined by algorithms, its text translated into dozens of languages, and its stories repurposed for video games and online forums. The knight's carefully crafted legacy is now in the hands of millions, each person finding a new use and a new meaning in his ancient words, proving that a story truly begins to live only after its author is gone. These fragile parchments ultimately teach us that history is not a single story, but a chorus of competing truths. Our journey through the hidden archives reveals that the Knightly Chronicle is a deeply human artifact, a testament to one person's struggle to be remembered. We have moved past the shining armor to find the man within, a figure entangled in debts and alliances, wrestling with his faith, and sometimes hiding a secret love in the lines of an official report. These documents are not cold records. They are the heated arguments, the quiet prayers, and the hopeful boasts of individuals who were as complex and contradictory as we are today. They prove that the grand sweep of history is built upon a million small, personal decisions. The next time you picture a knight, remember the real person who lived behind that legendary image. He was a man who hoped his story would outlive him, and thanks to the survival of these precious manuscripts, it finally has. We would love to hear which of these hidden stories resonated most with you. Was it the economic reality behind the armor, the secret love letter, or the knight erased from history? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this journey into the past, subscribe for more explorations where history's quietest voices are finally heard.